Our next speaker this morning doesn't need much of an introduction either. I'm delighted to say that Dr. Kossoff came over to talk to us from Johns Hopkins about the really exciting work he's doing with the different forms of treatment. Without further ado, will you please welcome Dr. Erick Kossoff.
Thanks, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually love speaking to parents. I love coming to England, and I also learned never say no to Emma. In general, we heard about great news about the ketogenic diet. The diet overall, not about side effects, but overall has some issues. Number one is no stranger to this audience. It's not always available everywhere. Not available in every center, not available in every country. And this can be a problem somewhat in terms of usage overall in the world of the ketogenic diet. In addition, again, no stranger to this community, it requires dietitian time, sometimes dietitian funding, and I also very strongly believe dietitian confidence. You sometimes don't get all three. The 4-day admission, we still admit children at Hopkins. I know some places, including here, around the world, they don't always admit for the ketogenic diet. But if you do, it's hassle for a busy family, for a family with many children, and it's also busy for doctors who have to take time out of their schedule for the ketogenic diet admission week. It's tough. Again, absolutely no stranger to this audience. It can be tricky. You have to bring foods to restaurants, schools, and parties. In general, there are certainly exceptions in familiar centers that do a lot of the ketogenic diet where they will offer it to teenagers. Almost never, except in very select situations, will be offered to adults. So there are some issues. I would say it's problems, but issues with the ketogenic diet. So are there any solutions? And that's what I'm going to talk about today and give you one example of actually the very first child that I put specifically on the modified Atkins diet. And all my patients are cute. They have to be sweet. This is Casey, one of my favorites. We don't have favorites, but she's one of my favorites. Casey, in March 2003, I was a very impressionable, relatively new faculty member at Hopkins. I saw Casey for her intractable seizures, along with John Freeman, who was actually her prior child neurologist before he retired. 7-year-old girl with very bad epilepsy since she was 6 months of age, was having seizures frequently and daily. She had tried 8 different anticonvulsant drugs, and we decided to put her on the ketogenic diet. The waiting list was actually relatively short. Our waiting list can go as long as 3 months. At the time, it was only 1 month. And the mom said, well, what is the ketogenic diet? We spent a few minutes discussing it with her, explaining what the ketogenic diet was. She still didn't quite understand what it was. So I explained to her, I said, it's a low-carb, high-fat diet. She said, oh, like the Atkins diet. I said, well, not really. But if you want to, you can start doing that. You can restrict carbohydrates, cakes, cookies, candy, try to restrict that from the diet. You can go out and buy the Atkins book just to get a sense of it, since it was a month away and could get her a little bit more used to the lifestyle change than I knew it would be for her. So I recommended she do that. Her seizure stopped. Actually never came back. This was without even doing the ketogenic diet. And I was, again, a young faculty member. I said, what are you doing? My dietitian said, what are you doing? And John Freeman said, I bet she's doing some sort of modification of the diet. And I suspect that she was probably ketotic. So actually, John Freeman and I had a bet. And I actually won because she was ketotic. I had a feeling she was ketotic. John didn't think she was. This is not worth very much, as you know. It wasn't worth much back then either. We actually went ahead and canceled her admission. We said, well, let's see how things go with this diet. And we can always do the ketogenic diet if we have to, which is where we're starting to do somewhat at Hopkins now. And she actually never, and still has never gone on the full ketogenic diet. We kept her. We figured she was doing, when we looked at her food records, of what she was actually eating, about 10 grams of carbohydrates per day. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So again, thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to do in the next half an hour, cut me off if I go too long, is talk about sort of our experience. And there's a lot of experience now in many studies. It's been 4 years since Casey. And now in 2007, I think we know a lot more, but there's still many unanswered questions about what this diet is, how does it work. And then near the end of my talk today, I'll try to talk about what I think the future of this diet may be and where it's starting to fit, at least at Hopkins. You'll hear about the low glycemic index diet from Heidi Pfeiffer in the next talk, and sort of where they're starting to use alternative diets. And it's a similar diet in a way to be perhaps less restrictive. This is a Halloween card to my daughter. It's Hansel and Gretel choosing not to go to the gingerbread house because of low-carb housing. Right, so first I'll talk about, I'll go through relatively quickly today, what this diet is. There's a lot of myths out there about what this diet is. Some families think it is not restrictive, it is easy, and it is absolutely not. So I'll talk about what this diet is, how it differs from the ketogenic diet, and then also why I call it the modified Atkins diet. Why is it not just the Atkins diet? And I'll talk about that today. We'll talk about the results now from 6 studies that are out. So it's been used quite a bit, not just from Hopkins, but from South Korea and Japan. And we'll talk about what I think is exciting, what it teaches us, and how it's changed how I use the ketogenic diet. Using this diet has sort of taught us and maybe hinted even into some basic science work, which we talked about during this conference already. Some of the basic science for why the diet works, this diet and Heidi's diet as well, give us some clues perhaps. It's not necessarily ketones. We'll talk as well about what our protocol is and what's evolved and what's changed over the time with these 6 studies over the last 4 years. And then I'll get a little bit philosophical about what I think the future of the modified Atkins diet may be. We'll have to see if that's true or not. So many of you know, and of course all of you should know what the ketogenic diet is. It is a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. It's a photograph from the United States of a typical day's worth of food on the ketogenic diet. It's actually sent to me from doctors I know in Sweden. It's actually drawn by my daughter. She's 6 years old and actually still thinks what I do is cool. In about 5-6 years, that won't be the case. So she kind of knows what I do with the diet, drew me some pictures. And it's generally the same on the Atkins diet. The foods on the modified Atkins diet are high-fat, low carbohydrate, moderate protein, or low protein. It depends sort of how you look at it. Foods, and the foods look relatively similar. And many families said that, and said, well, really, is there a difference? And I'm sure many of you here in the audience say, again, what are the differences between these diets? There are a lot of similarities, and this is somewhat of why we thought the modified Atkins diet made some sense. We'll talk about the differences which made us want to use it. But in terms of similarities, they're both low-carb, high-fat diets. Both can be used long-term. The Atkins people, when they talk about weight loss, don't tell you to do it for 6 months. Unfortunately, a lot of people do lose weight, and then they go off and gain their weight back again. But it's supposed to be, for weight loss, something you stay on long-term. On the modified Atkins diet and the ketogenic diet for epilepsy, it can be very long-term. We have some children on the diet 10, 20 years, if they have to be. Poorly regarded by the medical community until recently. It sort of changed in the mid-90s in the United States, and it's starting to change here in the United Kingdom and around the world. Similarly for the Atkins diet, for obesity, it had a bad reputation. 2001, 2002, that started to change as data came out, and that's what usually changes things, is data, that it's effective for weight loss. Weight loss can occur, obviously that's on purpose for the Atkins diet. It's in general a side effect on the ketogenic diet, so a little bit of some differences. Neither are healthy diets. I echo what Helen mentioned. I think you can make it healthier, but these are diets that require medical and dietitian supervision. They all require vitamin supplementation. These are diets that shouldn't be done without somebody overseeing and watching the child to make sure they're doing well. The most exciting similarity and what got our interest, and certainly in Casey's situation, was ketosis. So actually, if you read the Atkins book, page 120, they talk about checking ketones. And we thought this was fascinating. And they use it as a way, surrogately, to monitor for weight loss. And we said, well, if this diet's making ketones, and this is what we thought back in 2003, maybe we don't have to be as restrictive with the ketogenic diet anymore. And maybe by itself this diet would work. Turned out that they were right. So how are they different? So why would we need another diet? Why am I here lecturing to you? Why do we need other diets? Well, there are some differences that make it an attractive option and perhaps solve to some degree some of the problems I mentioned in the first slide. The ketogenic diet is about 90% fat, with the majority of what's left made up of protein. The standard normal diet most people are eating today is a mixture of all three: carbohydrates, protein, fat, and anything more carbohydrates than everything else. The modified Atkins diet, and to some extent the low glycemic diet, which Heidi will talk about, are generally, we think, about a 1-to-1 in-between type of diet, 1-to-1 ratio of fats to carbohydrates and protein. Still a high-fat diet, no doubt. The modified Atkins diet, and I'll talk about this today, why it's modified, is a high-fat, encouraged high-fat diet. But this is what gets us excited, is that there's really a lot less restrictiveness. There's no calorie restriction. They can eat all they want, to some degree. We don't want them to gain significant amounts of weight, but it's not restricted in terms of calories, fluids. There's no hospital admission, no fast, although some centers are doing it without an admission, without fast. But on the Atkins diet, we don't do that on purpose. And there's no weighing foods. They measure carbohydrate content, looking in books, looking in guides, looking on the internet, but they're not actually weighing and measuring foods on grams. gram scales. It's a little bit easier to do. So this is the differences. This is what has made us interested. There's also options. It's gotten a little bit less in the United States as the fad has died to some degree. But there still are a lot of low carbohydrate products, which we initially tell families to stay away from while they're starting the modified Atkins diet. But after time, they can start using these, and these can help a bit. A little more crunchier foods than typically on the ketogenic diet, and can help with compliance to some degree as long as the families read the labels very carefully. There are a lot of nice options in some restaurants, some low carbohydrate foods that some dietitians are working on and some chefs are working on. How is it modified? Why do I call it my modified Atkins diet? There are three main reasons. Number one, the Atkins book says sure, have lots of high fat. On the modified Atkins diet, it's encouraged. It's really strongly encouraged, almost with every meal, that the food should look like ketogenic diet foods. In fact, we give them ketogenic diet recipes, but tell them don't worry about weighing and measuring and using those gram amounts. So high-fat foods are encouraged, not just a good idea as they are on the Atkins diet. In addition, on the Atkins diet, they say 20 grams of carbohydrates per day for the first 2 weeks and then slowly increase based on how much weight you're losing. On our modified Atkins diet, and our protocol has changed slightly over the years, we actually start them much lower and stay there. We don't go up 20, 30, 40 as they do on the Atkins diet. So we stay low, and we start low and we stay low. And then lastly, on the Atkins diet book, most of the book discusses weight loss, discusses sort of monitoring your weight and trying to keep your weight down or lose weight. On the Atkins diet, and the modified Atkins diet, we tell them not to read those sections of the book. That's not what we're trying to do. Okay. What's the data? What's, pun intended, the meat of the discussion? What do we know? Okay, that certainly sounds good. It sounds reasonable. What does the evidence, what does the published literature say about this diet? Well, as a result of Casey, actually Casey was one of 6 patients that we first published in 2003, we decided to do a prospective, formal, open label, so no control, unlike Helen's study. But we just put 20 children with intractable epilepsy, very similar criteria to Helen's study, in fact. Both young children and teenagers with intractable seizures on the Atkins diet as per the protocol I mentioned before, and I'll mention again in a few minutes. And this was funded about halfway through the study by the Robert C. Atkins Foundation, which was very generous. And as halfway through the study, they funded it. All of the patient visits were covered, so families were able to come for free. This was 20 children. The average age was about 6 years, a mix of young children and teenagers. Equally did well. I'll show you the results. They needed to have 7 seizures per week. They needed to try 2 drugs. They easily met those criteria. These were pretty desperate families. And just like Casey, all my patients have to be cute. They like to send me pictures too, which I like to put on my wall. So of the 20 patients, 16 of them made it through the 6-month study. So it seemed to be, as we suspected, it would be relatively tolerable. 16 of them made it through the study. At 6 months, they were given the option to either come off the diet, go to the full ketogenic diet, or continue. And actually 14 decided they wanted to stay on the modified Atkins diet. 1 went to the full ketogenic diet, stayed about the same. Her seizures didn't get any better. She was doing well already. And then 1 child that even made it to the full 6 months decided not to stay on it anymore. The results were actually, in this study, somewhat better, in fact, than the ketogenic diet. Subsequent studies have brought it down to about what the ketogenic diet looks like. But at least in this early study, the results showed about a 2/3 response rate, as opposed to the 50% that most studies now quote, response rate being a 50% reduction or higher. And half of those children, so 7 out of 20, that made it through the study had a 90% improvement, and 4 were seizure-free. After 1 month, as part of the protocol, they were allowed to reduce medications. Many of them chose to take that option, and many of them did well. So there were some interesting tidbits, and I won't go into all the details, but one thing that we found very exciting and surprising was ketosis. So one surprise was how ketotic these children were made with the modified Atkins diet, and how generally less restrictive this diet was. Despite that, their ketones were high, and they were high quick. So within about 2 days, I was getting phone calls from some families about, is this normal? They were maybe a little sleepy, their breath smelled fruity for some reason. Very, very quickly, they were making very high ketones. What was another surprise was it didn't last. So the ketones went up, stayed high very quickly, and then they started drifting down. About 75% of these children over the 6-month study drifted from high to moderate to trace, and some children actually had no ketones by the end of the study. Heidi will talk about that in her low glycemic diet, something that they see even from the start. On our study, as time went on, it actually drifted downwards. But what was also interesting was it didn't matter. We had children who had no ketones by the end of the study who were still seizure-free. We had some children who were making high ketones who weren't doing as well. It didn't correlate with seizure efficacy, as basic science is now starting to show. And even on the ketogenic diet, the evidence that ketones really matter is actually very scant. And this actually shows that at 1 month, it did seem to matter. Having high ketones mattered, but as time went on in the study, it really didn't seem to make much of a difference. This information hinting that maybe that first month, ketones do need to be high. You want to get them very ketotic, but after that, it didn't seem to matter. And this also has panned out in our second Atkins study. Another interesting note was caloric restriction. There are some basic scientists who feel very strongly that why the ketogenic diet works, one of the potential mechanisms might be calorie restriction. One of the things we do on the ketogenic diet. On the Atkins diet, we didn't do this. So we said, well, maybe let's see, does it matter? Does weight loss, if they're losing weight, do they do better than if they're not losing weight? And actually, it didn't seem to matter. Most children did not lose weight. Many of the children gained weight, 13 to 20, and also didn't seem to matter. Changing a bit how we do the ketogenic diet. We're not as strict about calories as we used to be. In terms of side effects, and I apologize, these are in US values. The two things that did change was BUN, blood urea nitrogen, sort of a reflection of how much protein they're probably eating. And most of them, as you saw on the graph, are probably having more protein than they were eating on their regular diet beforehand. So that increased, but creatinine, a measure of how the kidney is handling that protein, was fine. So just sort of reflecting more protein in their diet. The total protein didn't change, but the BUN did. Cholesterol, again, this is in US values, it went up about 20%. Statistically, 0.05 or less is statistically significant. It wasn't quite statistically significant. Subsequent studies have actually pushed it towards significance. So this is one thing that I do recommend in any child who goes on a modified Atkins diet, that they do watch their total cholesterol. HDL cholesterol, LDL, triglycerides did not change. We still watch those too, but total cholesterol does seem to increase on the modified Atkins diet. Not a big surprise. It's still a high-fat diet. Where are we today? November 2007. Now, 4 years later, there have actually been 6 studies. This is actually a photograph that was emailed to me from Dr. Ito, who used the diet for GLUT1 deficiency in Japan. I don't know what the foods are, but I think they're kind of cool. And now in 69 published children, and we'll talk about our adult study, which just came out too, which brings us up to about 100. And there's been about 100 children altogether, with some outside of study being started on the Atkins diet. The numbers are actually shockingly similar. Again, there's no head-to-head study yet that's been done, but historically very similar to what we see on the ketogenic diet. 48%, that number is very similar to what Helen mentioned before in meta-analyses done of large numbers of studies of the ketogenic diet. We're in the process, almost completed now, of the ketogenic diet consensus statement, where we're gathering experts on the ketogenic diet, including Dr. Frost, Maggie Pfeiffer, many others, trying to put together our collective knowledge in terms of the consensus statement. And one thing I asked in this consensus was, do you use alternative diets? Both the Atkins diet, low glycemic index diet. The large majority of physicians familiar with the ketogenic diet are using this as well. But interestingly, they're still using the ketogenic diet for other things, including teenagers. Actually, the majority still feel for teenagers. I tend to use the modified Atkins diet for teenagers, but actually the majority of ketogenic diet experts aren't, at least yet. We'll see if that changes. One study that was just completed a few months ago and published was looking at 10 grams versus 20 grams. My hypothesis was it wouldn't matter, because over time I saw if I went up to 20 or 30 grams, it didn't seem to matter. It turned out actually it seemed to, surprisingly, at the 3-month period, if you start them on 10 grams a day, they did better than 20 grams a day. And it related a little bit to ketosis, but even beyond that, there were certain factors why that occurred that we don't understand. But again, gets back to maybe that first month is what matters the most. This is a study that came out about 3 weeks ago, which is, and I'll talk about the future, where I think the modified Atkins diet is likely to head. I'm not sure it's going to replace the ketogenic diet. I'm not sure it should replace the ketogenic diet. It might solve some of those issues I mentioned in the first slide about availability. I think it may solve some of the issues with adults. And this was a study that I did for adults, and I like to take care of kids more. But I decided to do the study for adults because I thought it was important, and it was actually not too bad. 30 patients, aged 18 to 53. The majority had a good response, actually slight minority, but 47%, generally similar to what we see on the ketogenic diet and the pediatric Atkins studies as well. That number just keeps coming back, 47, 48, anywhere in that range. The weight loss was good. A lot of families wanted to lose weight. A lot of patients wanted to lose weight and have their epilepsy better. They had both. Cholesterol increased slightly as well. Similar percent increases, children on the Atkins diet, and generally similar, Heidi and I were just talking about this, perhaps a little bit better than what we see on the ketogenic diet for cholesterol, but just still a general 20 to 30% increase over time. What I did find sort of on the negative side was it was tough. Even though I thought it would be a reasonable diet to do, it's certainly easier than the ketogenic diet, which is very sporadically offered to adults. 10 of these patients, even some who had excellent seizure control, decided to drop out. Tough when a parent doesn't tell you to do it, when it's the parent themselves. So actually 30% dropped out before 3 months, even those had a good response sometimes. The median time to improve, getting back to some of the good news, was quick. So what I tell families now and patients nowadays that are adults is that it should work quick. I know it's a tough diet. I know even if it works, you may drop out, you might find it difficult, but you're going to know quickly. And that's what we're also starting to see with the ketogenic diet, is that if it does work, it works relatively quickly. So where I'm sort of heading now, at least in the near future with the modified Atkins diet, is really trying to get a very good, very strict, almost a tough love first month. We call it sort of the golden month idea that we've come up with. Very good evidence that that first month, having high ketones, a very strict diet matters. After that, you don't need to. You can actually lighten up considerably in some research after that first month. 10 grams a day, high fat. We actually have a grant in to potentially look at KetoCal, sort of a lunch substitute, but just for that first month, and then they can stop taking it. And also, again, if it's not helping quickly, you can stop it. What's my protocol? So what has changed as a result of all of this research? If a family comes to see me today and they say, I want to start the diet, how do I tell them to do it? And this has changed, and it still is in a process of changing, but this is my current protocol, and it should be in your handout if people are curious. It's meant to be simple. That's kind of part of it. I think if it was too complicated, there really wouldn't be much point. So the first month is tough. The first month is a trickier month for the families, but then it does lighten up. 10 grams of carbs per day. I tell them to eat lots of high-fat foods, butter, heavy whipping cream, oils, mayonnaise, things they would be eating on the ketogenic diet, and they should be eating quite a bit of. I give them a lot of recipes and websites. I'll show you some screenshots of what some of them are. The first month, because my dietitian is very busy with the ketogenic diet, she's around, but she's really not there for that very first visit. Most of it is me. And if it works, and we'll talk about it after the first month, then my dietitian gets involved in making sure that they stay healthy on this diet. But in terms of the initial counseling, I do most of it, or the majority. They take a multivitamin and a calcium supplement. I have them check ketones for the first month twice a week, and they check their weight every week. For the first month, I tell them, let's see what the diet can do by itself. Leave your medicines unchanged. I know you want to reduce medicines, but let's wait. Baseline labs, including a lipid profile. Again, data suggests you probably should be keeping an eye on these things, so I tell them to get these initially. And then I say, give me a call in a month. Let me know how it's going. Start this. Go ahead, do it. I give them information. It takes me about 30 to 40 minutes in the clinic to teach them how to do it. It's not meant to be complicated. Again, that's, in a way, sort of the point. There's a lot of information out there they can go read, and I tell families to read. Information in terms of carbohydrate contents. I tell them to buy a carbohydrate and fat counter guide that gives you information about all the foods. There's more foods than I can keep track of, so I tell them to buy a guide. My dietitian has created some sample meals, some sample recipes, just to show them what the foods look like. I find it very easy, and you might agree. It's very easy for me to say what you can eat. It's a little trickier to say what you can eat. So I think we've learned over time with the modified Atkins diet that just like the ketogenic diet, I have to give them a little bit in terms of recipes. I tell them to go to the Atkins website. Just be careful, look at what the carb contents are, but there's good ideas, good recipes there. There's a lot of good websites besides Emma's website. There are some families that have created support networks, including one for the Atkins diet. This is Atkins for Seizures, that actually a family in Colorado created on their own with recipes and support. I tell them to go to epilepsy.com, which actually Emma's written for, Heidi's written for, and I ask some other families to write for. Lots of information on there about the diets, recipes, good ideas. And then I tell them, of course, buy my book, which Emma's giving away, actually. And then after the second month, they can lighten up. I pretty much only automatically now go to 20 grams of carbs a day. It just makes it a lot easier for these families. I tell them they can probably stop checking ketones. Kind of interesting idea, but it does seem that you could probably stop, at least on the modified Atkins diet. I seem to show that you can stop after that point. Check their weight weekly. They can start lowering medicines if they want, carefully, one at a time, one change at a time. They can start very carefully. Again, also one new low-carb product at a time, usually one per day is what I tell families. Just be careful about what the labels say. And then if it is working, then I have them scheduled to come back into our monthly ketogenic diet clinic, which is incorporated with other ketogenic diet patients. And then we actually see them and make sure dietary-wise, nutritionally, health-wise, they're doing well. In the last few minutes, where are we going? What's sort of the near future, the present? If families ask me, which one should I do? What do I tell them? And then where do I see the diet in the future? If I'm nice enough, if family invites me back in a few years, where would I be maybe talking about that? So when do I choose keto? When do I choose Atkins? And I think this is also, for me and many of the other doctors at Hopkins, that in a way are kind of grappling with this new diet and trying to fit it into their treatment algorithm. How do I choose? Family emails me, a mother asks me in clinic, which one should I pick? How do I choose? Well, there are some situations where I say, absolutely you should do Atkins. I personally believe that. And there are some situations where I say, absolutely not, you should do the ketogenic diet. In terms of Atkins, this is in your handout, maybe a little hard to read. If they have very limited financial resources, which is a problem in the United States with some insurance companies not approving the admission and otherwise, if it's a situation perhaps financially where they're far away from a ketogenic diet center, but the neurologist is willing to do the Atkins diet, that's a situation where I think they should do the Atkins diet in that potential situation. If it's a teenager, I personally feel strongly, though again many other ketogenic diet experts are still using the full ketogenic diet for teenagers, I'm starting to use more the Atkins diet for teenagers. And I think no one at this point with the recent publication would argue about adults using either the Atkins or the low glycemic diet in adults. It's just a whole lot easier to do. A very busy family with many, many children where either admission or the entire process would be very difficult to do, I might push them towards the Atkins diet. And emergency situations where I say, I need to start this child immediately, at least in my opinion. A child who comes into my office with new onset myoclonic astatic epilepsy, people know what that is, sort of a 3-4-year-old with frequent drop seizures, very bad epilepsy, but intellectually and a lot of their EEG may look relatively normal. We have very good evidence now that the ketogenic diet works extremely well, and some people talk about using it first line in that situation. I might suggest the Atkins diet right off the bat, not waiting until medicines have been tried. What about the ketogenic diet? In some situations, I say, no way. You shouldn't do the modified Atkins diet. It doesn't make, at least logistical sense. It's not going to gain you anything. An infant, a child who's gastrostomy tube, who can get ketogenic formula. I mean, you could argue, my dietitian has talked to me and argued with me about it. She said, well, you could use a 1-to-1 formula. And that may be true. But in terms of the modified Atkins diet, the solid food diet, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not less restrictive than a formula fed. And also, it worries me a little bit in terms of the Atkins diet is very much open-ended and parent-run. Nutritionally, anyone under age 2, I like to keep a closer eye on in terms of growth and other issues. There's good evidence that you probably should for under age 2. If the parents request it, if they really want those strict menus, if they really need guidance, and certain families are different, as many of you know, some families really need that very strict guidance. The modified Atkins diet just may not be for them. They may need the actual, real specific dietitian recipes. Anyone in the middle really depends. Depends on the situation, and we make decisions based on each individual child. Other than these 2 categories, who we pick. We'll sometimes go back and forth. We're starting to do this more and more. If someone is on the ketogenic diet and finds it too tough over time, or they've been on it for many years, we may slowly transition them to the Atkins diet. And actually vice versa. We've had some children who've had a good response, but maybe wish if they could potentially do better. Or they just don't get those ketones to stay high, as we typically see, and some families absolutely correlate it in their own individual child with improvement. And they say, ketones were great, seizures were great, now ketones aren't so high and the seizures are worse. Some of those situations, we'll sit down, we'll talk, we'll discuss it, and actually go to the full ketogenic diet in that. What about the future? Last 2 or 3 slides. Where do I see the diet going in the future? This may be a guess, this may be completely off, but this is sort of what I think both diets, the low glycemic diet, which you'll hear about next, and the modified Atkins diet, where it may be headed. As I mentioned, for myoclonic astatic epilepsy, we're starting more and more to just go straight to the diet. Excuse me, we're doing this sometimes with the ketogenic diet, but it's a lot easier for a family, when you're discussing options, to think about using a diet like the modified Atkins diet first line. What would you do back then? It's sort of an interesting question. We actually had a family with new onset myoclonic astatic epilepsy. I recommended the modified Atkins diet. The family was unsure about that or medications. Their pediatrician was actually one of our super responder parents. Turned out, ask your pediatrician. They're one of our biggest supporters. They went back, asked the pediatrician, said try medicine, which is kind of a big surprise to us. So kind of, we have to sometimes put ourselves in parents' shoes, and they said, the diet's tough. So actually the family tried medicine first. It didn't work. We actually went on the Atkins diet eventually. But although it's nice for me to say, and certainly Emma and others, I think it's certainly reasonable to believe, why not use the diet as first-line therapy? Drugs are easier, and it's still easy for me to say, but it's difficult to do. And even the modified Atkins and low glycemic index diet, certainly more time-intensive than medications. What about third world countries? This is another thing where I think the modified Atkins diet may play a role. A center that doesn't have a dietitian may not have sort of situations where they could do all the labs, all the keto sticks, all the things involved for the ketogenic diet, and certainly the foods are more expensive than sort of the average foods. I think it makes sense. It certainly is cheaper than drugs, but I'm often humbled when I discuss the option with physicians in third world countries. It certainly is not cheaper than rice and bread. So it's an option. I think we may start seeing it used more often, but I don't think it's going to have a huge widespread indication in the third world. There are certainly centers, to show you the graph of centers around the world offering the ketogenic diet. There are certainly centers that do not, mostly, and they tend to be in the third world, Africa, Central America, parts of Southeast Asia as well. Whoa, we actually heard a lecture about this yesterday. What about using it for things other than epilepsy? This is something also, I think, maybe not in the near future, but at least 10, 20 years from now, we're going to start seeing, I think, the modified Atkins and low glycemic diets used for things other than epilepsy. Is there any data to support this? Amazing amounts of data. So this is, in some situations, limited cases, in some situations, animal studies. The list grows almost every other month. It seems like there's something new coming on the market in terms of publications describing the use of diets, ketogenic or Atkins, I've seen both, for these conditions. Mostly, interestingly, neurologic conditions, although there are some that are looking at obesity and diabetes and polycystic ovarian disease. So I think people will start using these to some degree, and these diets may be starting to be used for these conditions. I think not much doubt for anybody. I think this really results of our study and others that are starting to come out looking at the Atkins diet for adults will give a nice therapy for adults with intractable epilepsy that they didn't have before. And then what we're starting to do as well is transition some families that have been on the diet for many, many, many years, where we wonder, again, the data would suggest that being super strict may only be important, maybe even that first month. After several years, maybe it makes sense in terms of side effect profile. We haven't really looked at that too much, comparing one versus the other. But it makes sense, as we typically lower ratios in patients who are having side effects, kidney stones, cholesterol changes, not gaining weight, growth issues. One of the most common things myself and my dietitian will do is lower the ratio. The Atkins diet is a 1-to-1 ratio. So it makes some sense that perhaps long-term keto initially and then switch them over. Whether this is true or not in clinical practice remains to be seen. I think we did well for time. Just to wrap up, and I'll be available for questions after Heidi and Ruby's talk later. Hopefully I convinced you that it's a new therapy, an interesting therapy, a valuable therapy. Where it will fall in the future, I don't know for sure. But it gives us more options, and I think more options is absolutely better. Whether you choose that option or not for any individual child, it certainly depends on the situation. It teaches us a lot about why the diet works. I think this is very exciting to many of us in the ketogenic diet field. We've been talking about this over the last 2 days of the conference, teaching us about ketosis, teaching us about caloric restriction, teaching us about how strict we need to be with these kids. There's obviously no stranger to this audience. Do we need to be as strict? Do we need to be checking blood work as frequently, ketones as frequently? Probably not. Lots of exciting uses in the future too, and we'll see what that takes us in the future. So I'd like to sort of thank all of you for coming. It's actually one of my patients, another one of my favorite patients, holding her mayonnaise jar. This is our ketogenic diet team. John Freeman, who has since retired, but taught me about the ketogenic diet. Patty Vining, Diana Pillis, Jim Rubenstein, and many of our staff and dietitians. My primary dietitian who's not here today, who's probably home taking care of all of my patients, is Zahaba Turner, who's our primary dietitian. I'd also like to thank Emma for inviting me here. I'd like to thank England for being such a great place to go. I'm a huge science fiction fan, so I'd also like to thank the BBC for bringing back Doctor Who. My absolute most favorite show when I was a child. I think it's actually even the new show's even better. And of course, I'd like to thank Emma for inviting me. It's been a pleasure being here, and thank you very much.